The security feed showed 4 Vrenken cubs standing outside the human cell. Chief Security Officer Vron nearly dropped his bowl of nutrient paste. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen. Then he blinked. The image didn't change. The containment cage was empty. The emergency seal on holding bay 3 was open. And 4 of the most dangerous juvenile predators in known space were gathered outside the door of an unconscious human. Oh no! The words slipped out before he could stop them. Across the bridge, Tix looked up from his console. The insectoid's antennae immediately stiffened. What happened? Vron pointed at the screen. Tix followed his gaze. 3 seconds later he emitted a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a mechanical failure. Oh no! Exactly. The bridge went silent. Every crew member stopped what they were doing. The image on the security monitor was impossible. The Vrenken cubs should have been inside a triple-layer containment field. They should have been sedated. They should have been locked behind reinforced alloy barriers. Instead, they were free. And they were standing outside the human's room. One of the cubs stepped forward. Its sightless face tilted toward the door. Then it gently touched the electronic lock with its forehead. Sparks exploded. The lock died instantly. The heavy door slid open. The cub walked inside. The other 3 followed. The screen showed only darkness. Then the camera feed abruptly died. Vron was already moving. His chair crashed backward onto the deck. Security team to holding bay 3. His voice thundered through the ship. Now. Red emergency lights flooded the bridge. Alarms erupted throughout the freighter. Crew members jumped from their stations. Tix scrambled after Vron as the massive Krellian stormed toward the lift. This is bad. Vron shot him a look. This is 4 Vrenken loose on my ship. Right. They are heading toward an unconscious human. Right. They just disabled a military-grade lock with their heads. Right. And somehow you think this situation is merely bad? Tix swallowed. Fair point. The lift doors opened. Vron marched inside. The doors closed. The ancient mechanism groaned as it carried them toward the lower decks. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Tix broke the silence. Do you think the human will survive? Vron looked at him. The question wasn't unreasonable. The Vrenken were apex predators. Not merely dangerous. Not merely aggressive. Apex predators. Entire colonies had been evacuated when adult Vrenken wandered too close to populated regions. Military units treated them with the same caution normally reserved for biological weapons. Even their cubs were lethal. Especially their cubs. Because cubs were curious. And curious predators tended to kill things. I don't know, Vron admitted. That worried him more than anything. Normally he always knew. Pirates. Shoot them. Smugglers. Arrest them. Mutiny. Shoot them first. But this? This was new. The lift reached subdeck 9. The doors opened. Vron immediately heard running footsteps. Security officers were converging from every direction. Weapons armed. Armor sealed. Faces pale. Nobody liked Vrenken. Nobody. 5 minutes later, 12 armed guards stood outside holding Bay 3. The corridor was silent. Unnaturally silent. Vron hated that. Dangerous things were supposed to make noise. Explosions made noise. Pirates made noise. Even reactor failures made noise. Silence meant something was waiting. And predators were very good at waiting. The holding bay door stood half open. Scorch marks covered the frame. The lock was completely destroyed. Vron raised his plasma rifle. His scales felt tight. He hadn't felt this nervous in years. Not since the mutiny on the Red Horizon. And that had involved explosives. "Chief," whispered one of the guards. "What? Shouldn't we call for military support?" Vron stared at him. "We are 3 weeks from the nearest patrol vessel." "Oh. Yes. Oh." Nobody spoke after that. The corridor felt colder. Finally Vron took a breath. Then he stepped forward. 1 pace. 2. 3. The doorway appeared. He raised his rifle. Prepared himself for blood. Prepared himself for screaming. Prepared himself for carnage. Then he looked inside. And completely forgot how to think. Behind him, Tix walked into his back. "What do you see?" Vron didn't answer. "What happened?" "Still nothing." "Chief." Finally Vron spoke. Very slowly. "I think." "What?" "I think we're going to need a bigger medical report." Tix pushed past him. Looked inside. And froze. The room was perfectly intact. No blood. No violence. No destruction. The human remained asleep on the cot. Wrapped in a thermal blanket. Breathing steadily. Completely unharmed. The 4 Vrenken cubs surrounded him. One lay beside his left arm. Another slept against his chest. A third had curled beneath the bed. The largest cub rested across his feet like an oversized guard dog. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The guards simply stared. After a full minute, Tix finally managed to find his voice. "What?" He stopped. Tried again. "What am I looking at?" Vron didn't know. The largest cub suddenly opened its mouth. Every weapon in the corridor snapped upward. The cub yawned. Then went back to sleep. The guards collectively lowered their rifles. One of them quietly sat down on the floor. "I think my brain broke." Nobody disagreed. 12 hours earlier the human arrived unconscious. That should have been the first warning sign. In Vron's experience, humans were rarely unconscious. They were usually running towards something dangerous. Or causing something dangerous. Occasionally both. The damaged escape pod had been found drifting near a dead star system. No distress beacon. No identifying transponder. No flight records. Just a battered capsule tumbling through space. The salvage team nearly ignored it. Then they scanned a life sign. A single passenger. Still alive. Barely. The pod was brought aboard. Vron personally supervised the recovery. The hatch had to be cut open. 3 plasma torches were destroyed in the process. The pod looked like it had survived a direct collision with an asteroid. Inside lay a human male. Mid-30s. Dark hair. Several broken ribs. Severe bruising. Minor radiation exposure. Somehow alive. Vron still wasn't sure how. The medical drone certainly wasn't. Its report had contained the phrase, survival probability statistically unreasonable. Twice. The human was transferred to Holding Bay 3. Mainly because Medical Bay lacked enough reinforced rooms. Nobody admitted that part out loud. Still. Everyone knew it. Humans made aliens nervous. Not because humans were strong. Humans weren't particularly strong. Not compared to most species. A Krellian could snap steel bars. A Vith could see through darkness. A Trakari could survive vacuum exposure for several minutes. Humans couldn't do any of those things. The problem was that humans never seemed aware of their limitations. If a Krellian saw an impossible situation, he avoided it. If a Vith saw an impossible situation, she retreated. If a human saw an impossible situation, he usually grabbed a wrench. Then things exploded. Somehow the human survived. And everyone else became concerned. It was a deeply confusing survival strategy. The unconscious passenger's file identified him as Mark Tanner. Occupation, Mechanical Systems Technician. Vron immediately disliked him. Every disaster report he'd ever read contained mechanics. Usually smiling. Usually holding tools. Usually moments before catastrophe. The human was sedated. Secured. Monitored. And largely forgotten. At least until Tix created another problem. The problem arrived in 4 crates. Vron noticed them during cargo inspection. The moment he saw the warning labels, his scales tightened. Tell me those are empty. Tix looked guilty. Which was never encouraging. They are not empty. Vron closed his eyes. Of course they weren't. When exactly were you planning to tell me? I was working up to it. You had 3 days. I needed more preparation. For what? The shouting. Vron opened the crate manifest. Then immediately wished he hadn't. Vrenken specimens. Quantity, 4. Status, live. He looked at Tix. Tix looked at the floor. Vron considered several career-ending acts of violence. Instead he chose professionalism. Barely. You brought Vrenken aboard. Technically the client brought them aboard. You approved it. They paid well. How well? Tix named a number. Vron nearly choked. That was enough money to replace half the ship. No wonder you approved it. Exactly. Vron pinched the bridge of his snout. You realize these things kill people. They're cubs. They're Vrenken cubs. Small Vrenken. Small explosives are still explosives. Tix didn't have a response. Because Vron was correct. The crates were transferred to auxiliary medical storage. Far away from the crew. Far away from passengers. Far away from absolutely everything. Or so Vron thought. Later he would discover that the room shared a wall with holding bay 3. The universe apparently enjoyed practical jokes. And Vron was usually the punchline. That evening the Cub started humming. Nobody slept. The sound traveled through the lower decks. Not loud. Just constant. A deep vibration. Almost below hearing range. Crew members complained of headaches. Engineers became irritable. The cook threatened to resign twice. Vron spent 6 hours investigating. Nothing was wrong. The Cub simply refused to stop. Which made no sense. Vrenken hummed while hunting. But there was nothing to hunt. The storage room was empty except for food supplies. And one unconscious human in the next compartment. Vron didn't connect the dots. Not yet. If he had, he might have evacuated the entire deck. At 2:13 ship time, the reactor entered its scheduled dampening cycle. Normally that wasn't important. This time it was. Power dipped. Systems shifted. Backup relays activated. Then a capacitor exploded. The blast wasn't large. Just enough. A single spark jumped into a secondary grid. The surge hit auxiliary medical storage. Containment systems flickered. Recovered. Flickered again. Then failed. 4 Vrenken cubs opened their eyes. And somewhere beyond the wall, an unconscious human's heart continued beating. Slow. Steady. Patient. Waiting. The first thing the cubs did after escaping wasn't attack anyone. They followed the heartbeat. Later, when Vron tried to explain it to himself, that was the only conclusion that made sense. For juvenile apex predators had been set loose on a freighter filled with 37 living beings. There were engineers, deckhands, mechanics, cooks, guards, and even a pair of smugglers hiding among the cargo manifests. Any one of them should have been easier prey than an unconscious human. Yet the cubs ignored every other life sign on the ship. They moved through the dim corridors like shadows, silent and purposeful. Security footage later showed them passing sleeping crew quarters without even slowing down. One engineer actually opened his cabin door halfway through their journey. The largest cub glanced at him, then continued walking. The engineer reportedly fainted before the door finished closing. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that Vron stood in the doorway of holding bay 3 watching 4 predators sleep around a human as though they had been raised together. The largest cub lifted its head briefly and stared toward him with its sightless face. Vron froze. Every guard behind him froze. The cub yawned again, then settled its head back across Mark's ankles. "I don't understand," whispered Tix. "Neither do I. Shouldn't they be eating him? Please stop saying that while they're listening." Nobody dared enter the room. Hours passed. The cubs remained exactly where they were. The human remained unconscious. The entire ship slowly became aware of the situation. Rumors spread faster than a reactor fire. By the second hour, half the crew had gathered at nearby junctions pretending they had legitimate reasons to be there. By the fourth hour, the cook was selling wagers on whether the human would survive. By the 6th hour somebody had started a betting pool on whether the cubs had adopted him or were simply marinating him for later. The medic threatened to eject everyone through an airlock if they didn't stop asking questions. Then something even stranger happened. The cubs stopped humming. For the first time since boarding the ship, the deep vibration vanished. The headache stopped. The nausea disappeared. Crew members who hadn't slept in nearly a day suddenly felt normal again. Tick spent hours reviewing biological scans. The results only confused him further. Every stress indicator in the cubs' bodies had dropped to baseline levels. Their heart rates were stable. Their hormone levels were normal. It looked less like a pack of predators guarding prey and more like a family taking a nap. Vron hated every second of it. Around the 10th hour he finally returned to the bridge for food. The nutrient paste somehow tasted worse than usual. He was halfway through the bowl when Tix rushed in carrying a datapad. "Chief, if the cubs have learned to open doors again, I don't want to know. It's the human." Vron immediately stood. "What about him? His vital signs are changing." 5 minutes later they were back outside holding Bay 3. The medical monitor mounted beside the door displayed a steady rise in neurological activity. Mark Tanner was waking up. Every security officer on the deck assembled outside the room. Weapons were raised. Safety catches disengaged. The tension was unbearable. One wrong movement could turn the room into a slaughterhouse. Inside, the human shifted beneath the blanket. The largest cub's ears twitched. Another lifted its head. Mark groaned softly. One eye opened. Then the other. He stared at the ceiling for several seconds. Vron waited for panic. Most beings woke from medical comas confused and frightened. This human simply looked annoyed. Slowly he turned his head. His gaze settled on the cub lying against his arm. He blinked. Then looked at the cub resting across his feet. Then the two curled together beside him. Silence filled the room. Every alien aboard the ship waited for the inevitable scream. Instead, Mark frowned thoughtfully. "Either I'm hallucinating," he muttered, "or somebody crossed a wolf with a tank." Vron stared. Tick stared. The cub nearest Mark lifted its head. The human reached out. Vron nearly had a heart attack. Mark scratched the creature behind one of its sensory ridges. The cub immediately collapsed sideways with a contented clicking noise. The entire security team collectively forgot how breathing worked. "Nope," Mark said. "Definitely dogs." One of the guards dropped his rifle. The sound echoed through the corridor. Every cub instantly looked toward the doorway. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Then Mark snapped his fingers. All 4 cubs immediately turned back toward him. Vron's brain stopped functioning. "Good boys," said the human. The lead cub pressed its enormous head into his chest. Vron had seen those jaws shear through military armor in training footage. Now the same creature looked like it wanted a belly rub. "Human," Vron finally shouted. "Do not move." Mark looked toward the doorway for the first time. "Oh. Hey. Those creatures are dangerous." Mark glanced down. One cub was currently trying to climb into his lap. "You sure?" They are classified biological hazards. Mate, this one just fell asleep on my leg. That is not the point. Seems like a pretty important point. The cubs began gathering around him as he slowly sat upright. One rested its head on his shoulder. Another leaned against his side. The biggest positioned itself directly between Mark and the armed security squad. Not aggressively. Protectively. Vron noticed the distinction immediately. The cubs trotted along happily. The largest occasionally bumped his shoulder with its head like an oversized puppy. They're harmless. Tix looked at the creature capable of tearing through armored bulkheads and wisely decided not to argue. The galley incident made things worse. Mark was eating breakfast when one of the cubs climbed under the table and fell asleep on his boots. Another rested its head in his lap. The cook walked out carrying a tray of synthetic protein scraps intended for waste disposal. Every cub immediately focused on him. The poor cook froze. His survival instincts activated. Slowly, very carefully, he set the tray down and backed away. The cubs devoured everything in seconds. After that they adored him. 3 days later the cook was proudly introducing himself as their favorite uncle. Vron considered transferring to another ship. Meanwhile, Mark discovered that the Zarek 4 was held together by engineering practices that bordered on criminal negligence. The first engine inspection nearly gave him an aneurysm. Who repaired this coolant manifold? He demanded. Silence filled the engine room. Eventually a mechanic raised one hand. I did. With adhesive? Industrial adhesive. This pipe reaches 800 degrees. Very expensive adhesive. Mark stared at him for several seconds. Then sighed. I need tools. The repairs began immediately. Within 48 hours engine efficiency increased by 11%. Fuel consumption dropped. 3 recurring mechanical failures vanished. The crew started treating Mark less like a rescued passenger and more like a miracle worker. The cubs accompanied him everywhere. They slept beside him while he worked. They followed him through maintenance tunnels. One somehow learned how to fetch tools. Nobody knew how. Not even Mark. I think he's smarter than some people I've worked with, he admitted. The cubs seemed pleased by the compliment. Weeks passed. Then came the transmission. Vron received it while reviewing cargo manifests. The message carried a black market encryption signature. His stomach sank immediately. The buyer. The one expecting delivery of 4 Vrenken cubs. This should be fun, he muttered. The call connected. A massive alien appeared on the screen. Scarred face. Expensive armor. Eyes that screamed professional criminal. Where are my cubs? He demanded. Vron considered lying. Unfortunately the buyer already had tracking records. There have been complications. Define complications. Vron glanced through the bridge viewport. On the cargo deck below, Mark was currently playing a game involving a wrench and 4 Vrenken. Somehow everyone looked happy. They've been adopted. The buyer blinked. What? By a human. Silence. What? It's a long story. I paid for apex predators. You did. Not pets. They're still predators. As if the universe wanted to participate in the conversation, one of the cubs appeared behind Mark and tackled him to the floor. Mark laughed. The cub rolled onto its back, demanding attention. Vron winced. The buyer stared. What am I looking at? Complications. The buyer disconnected. 3 days later, a pirate vessel appeared on long-range sensors. Vron wasn't surprised. Angry criminals rarely accepted refunds. The pirate ship was larger, faster, better armed. Under normal circumstances, the Zarek IV would have surrendered immediately. Unfortunately, these weren't normal circumstances anymore. Red alarms echoed through the freighter. Crew members rushed to battle stations. Mark arrived on the bridge carrying a toolbox. What's happening? Pirates. Serious pirates. The worst kind. There's a better kind. Not really. The pirate vessel moved into attack position. Weapons locked. Engines charged. The captain's face appeared on the communication screen. Prepare to be boarded. Nobody responded. The pirate captain frowned. Did you hear me? Before Vron could answer, movement appeared behind Mark. 4 Vrenken stepped onto the bridge. They weren't cubs anymore. Months of growth had transformed them into something far more impressive. Larger. Stronger. Faster. Their shoulders nearly reached Mark's chest. Their claws clicked softly against the deck. The pirate captain saw them. Then saw another one enter the room. Then another. His expression changed instantly. Are those Vrenken? Nobody answered. Why are there 6 Vrenken on that ship? Still nobody answered. One predator rested its head on Mark's shoulder. Another sat beside his chair. The pirate captain stared for several seconds. Then looked directly at Mark. Human. Yeah. Are those your Vrenken? Mark scratched one behind the sensory ridge. Pretty much. Silence followed. Finally the pirate captain sighed. Helm. Sir. Turn the ship around. His first officer looked confused. Because of the predators? The pirate captain shook his head. No. Then why? He pointed toward Mark. Because if 6 Vrenken willingly follow one human around, then that human knows something about survival that I absolutely do not. The pirate ship immediately jumped to hyperspace. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody argued. The threat vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The bridge remained silent. Then Tix began laughing. A moment later the crew joined him. Even Vron smiled. Mark looked confused. What? Nothing, said Vron. Just thinking. About what? Vron looked at the human. Then at the 6 predators surrounding him. Then at the ancient freighter that somehow seemed luckier these days. About how the galaxy spent centuries fearing Vrenken. Reasonable. Turns out the smarter decision was fearing the idiot who adopted them. Mark grinned. One of the Vrenken bumped his shoulder affectionately. Another curled up beside his chair. Outside the viewport, stars streamed past as the Zarek IV continued its endless journey through the darkness. The ship still rattled. The engine still complained. The crew still argued. But somehow it felt more like a home than a freighter now. And across the outer rim, a story slowly spread from station to station, from smugglers to traders, from pirates to patrol captains. It told of an ancient cargo ship protected by 6 apex predators. It told of a human mechanic who treated monsters like family. Most people assumed the story was exaggerated. Until they saw the ship themselves. Then they wisely decided to leave it alone. Because the galaxy was a dangerous place full of things that could kill you. Pirates. Warlords. Rogue AIs. Ancient horrors drifting between stars. But according to rumor, none of them were quite as terrifying as a human who looked at the galaxy's deadliest predators and decided they looked cold.